This is FRM Part 2, Book 4, Liquidity and Treasury Risk Measurement and Management, and the chapter on Liquidity Transfer Pricing, a Guide to Better Practice. When I think of transfer pricing, I can't help but think of what goes on inside of my household. Lots of times I have my three boys ask me to do something for them collectively, and it's fairly easy to assign a transfer price between and among each one of them, and for me to estimate the benefits that I get out of whatever that transaction was. However, when one of them asks me for something individually, my first response is always something like, well, if I do this for you, what do I get out of it? And my sons, they try to be good sons, and they say something like, well, Dad, how about if I give you another big hug? Or how about if I spend more time with you in the future? And so those are awesome, benefits of being a parent, but from a financial standpoint, it doesn't do me a whole lot of good. So this transfer pricing inside of my household is important, but I am thinking that there are financial implications, but also emotional and parenting and all those other implications, which are absent from transfer pricing, especially liquidity transfer pricing inside of financial institutions. Now, this chapter was written as part of a working paper series from the Bank for International Settlements. And I thought it very interesting that if you look in the source chapter, it refers to this as an occasional paper. And I found out that the BIS has this working series for economists and analysts inside of its organization, but it also allows papers to be published from outside authors. And so this is one of those occasional outside authors. Here's the guy, Joel Grant. He's from the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. And I wanted to start this slide deck off with a quote. Now, before I read that to you, I want to remind you that this chapter is basically written exactly like some other chapters beforehand, in so far that we're looking at the difference between two time periods. This chapter is clearly written for the period before the financial crisis in 2008, and then the period after the financial crisis in 2008. And it struck me as kind of odd that we seem to have a series of these before and after events. We had the dot-com bubble in 2000. We had September 11th, and around that same time. We had the stock market crash in 1987, oil prices in 1970, et cetera, et cetera. So it struck me as interesting that really these before and after periods are really kind of just a series of blips or spikes, however you want to look at it on a graph. And so the important thing is for us to make certain that we learn from these events, from these financial crises. And so I want to read this quote to you. And I want to go back to this throughout the slide deck here. All right, you ready? In the years preceding the global financial crisis, liquidity was plentiful and cheap. All right, that sounds an awful lot like, okay, if liquidity was plentiful and cheap before 2007, let's say, then probably financial institutions were not too worried about it. All right. And as we now know, liquidity is unsustainably plentiful. So it's plentiful for long time periods, but it can't be sustained indefinitely, but it's still cheap. I thought this was really a cool quote, and I wanted to share that with you so that you get a sense of maybe the underlying theme that this author had as he was writing this particular chapter. 4 learning objectives, and boy, those first couple ought to be pretty familiar. In fact, my recommendation is to go ahead and put yourselves together for a matrix, best practices and challenges, and go back through all of those chapters that have best practices and challenges in those learning objectives. So then you'll have them right in front of you. That's an easy way to remember all these things. All right, discuss the process of liquidity transfer pricing. And then I think that third one is probably the most important of the 4. Compare the various approaches to liquidity transfer pricing. And then we'll end with a couple of slides on contingent liquidity risk, and we'll do a quick calculation on our last slide. All right, how about if we just go ahead and define this liquidity transfer pricing? There's a good illustration there on the right. Look at each of those tall rectangles in blue. Those are the business units. So for large financial institutions, what do those things look like? They look like, retail banking, trading in treasury securities, mortgages, wealth management, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, inside of my household, I have three units for 3 of my sons. And then notice from the top, and I like this part here, cost, benefit, and risk of each of those business units. Now remember, in that risk culture chapter and some subsequent chapters, we talked about this at length, that chief risk officer has to be on top of costs, benefits, and risk flowing down and back up from each of those business units. But then the correlation between and among all of those business units is critical. So that's going to apply here in liquidity transfer pricing and the liquidity aspect of these business units, much like it did in those previous chapters. Look at that circle point there over on the left. Requires pooling and integration of information across a bank's assets and liabilities. So this is the job of the business unit manager. It's the job of the chief risk officer. It's the job of all of the other senior leaders, which of course get their lead from the board of directors. Second block point, essentially an internal measurement system designed to assign a liquidity adjusted profit contribution value. All right, so look at each one of those tall rectangles. So think about what that means for retail banking, liquidity adjusted profit contributions. So we have profit, right? And we can easily compute some kind of profit, however we want to define that, but let's adjust it for liquidity. Oh, this is super important. And then that last circle point down there at the bottom, and effectively this LTP is an attempt to establish the economic value from each one. Like think of my 3 sons. I mean, the economic value is essentially when and if they ever grow up, graduate from college and get jobs and become independent from me financially, that will be that economic value. Of course, that's a future value. For some of my children, it's a way, way future value. But here, inside of financial institutions, that economic value is going to be at least today, and it might be another week or month. And of course, we can take present values if we want to, but these are liquidity issues, so these are short-term in nature. Now we're going to mention this concept of decentralization and centralization here in a couple of slides. And so I want you to think about this as a centralized process. Look in the middle there. The central pool or the internal treasury. So think of a handful of really smart men and women who are designed to handle the treasury of the entire financial institution. All right, let's go ahead and figure out what's determined the liquidity position that's based on some external and internal factors. Look there in the bolder blue under internal treasury, liquidity cushion. Boy, we spent a whole chapter talking about the cushion, and then in another chapter, remember, a different author called it a buffer. So we have this buffer, we have these cash flows coming in and out, and we have this cushion or buffer. And so let's start in this process by looking out to the right and the left. This is balance sheet stuff. So let's go over to the light purple. These are asset generating units, right? And so notice the arrows for all of these, but these arrows go, backwards and forwards into the internal treasury group. Then over on the left-hand side, let's call that the light orange. These are liability generating business units. So you got assets and liabilities there on the left and the right, just like they belong on the balance sheet. And so those funds are flowing, those liquidity issues are flowing to the internal treasury. And then complicating factors for those really smart men and women is the trading business, which uses funds and provides funds and receives charges. So there's lots and lots of liquidity flows going down and back up from the trading businesses. So those are the internal parts. And then, of course, the external part there is the interbank market. So let me go back to that comment I made that internal treasury has to be staffed, of course, by really smart men and women. Why is liquidity transfer pricing important? Let me just go back to that quote that I began the slide deck for. Before the global crisis of 2007 and 2008, banks took liquidity for granted. Boy, we should all just take a collective sigh and say, okay, if the liquidity was cheap, if the charges were cheap, if everything was around it was cheap and there was plenty of it, then, I'm not so sure we can be too highly critical of banks for taking liquidity for granted. Now, we can be at least have some level of criticism there, but probably not a lot. Some form of liquidity transfer pricing, but it had major deficiencies. And one of those big assumptions was that there would always be infinite funds available at a very low cost. And this is probably because banks could obtain financing, medium-term and long-term funding at just a small margin over those swap rates. And so if you think about it, there was little incentive to have a strong liquidity management practice. And so here's where I want to stop and give you, one of my life lessons that I try to impart to my children. Here we are, this human race. None of us are perfect, and nobody expects us to be perfect. So financial institutions are collections of individuals. So these organizations can't possibly be expected to be perfect. But it is reasonable to expect us to learn from our mistakes. Do not make the same mistake twice. Clearly don't make it multiple times. So that's the important part of this particular chapter. There are lots of stuff that we can learn from that 2008 financial crisis, and liquidity transfer pricing is among the more important. So look at that last corner point down there. These banks failed to recognize the true nature of liquidity risk embedded in their business activities. And it might be because the embedded liquidity risk was, can you guys see that? I mean, maybe it was just this big back then. However, it went like this and went like this. Actually, it went really, really quickly, as you guys know, from 2008. Continuing on in this discussion, at many banks, liquidity transfer pricing was not defined. And there were no protocols, there were no rules, there were no guidelines, right? So that if you're just describing this transfer pricing between and among the business units, and each of those business units is managing liquidity in a profitable manner, then, there's probably no need for a centralized operation. Of course, we found out pretty quickly that there probably was a need for it. Decentralized funding structures, little or no internal controls, not done on a granular level, and then, of course, the compensation structure for both those individuals inside of those business units and their managers probably did not consider liquidity funding costs and clearly ignored the risks. Oh, look at that. Look at that second to last one. There were no stress tests. You guys should say to yourself, boy, we have talked about the importance of stress tests. We've talked about the importance of liquidity stress tests, and we've talked about the importance of just stressing the environment. And so it ought to include transfer pricing as well. And look at the final one down there. Illiquid long-term assets were funded with cheap short-term liabilities. Oh, well, that's a big summary of what the problem was. All right, here's a good slide to remember for best practices. All right, centralized management, we've already discussed that. That sounds really important. A well-defined process, principles, and rules. Here, let me give you the, kind of a current state of events application of a well-defined process. If you go back to 2019 and ask anybody, no matter what country they're living in, if you ask them this question, hey, suppose somebody gets, potentially a really serious sickness, and lots of other people have those same symptoms, what do you do? Well, people would look around and say, well, I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. But now you think about what happened in March of 2020 at the beginning of the COVID crisis. Well, political leaders and health leaders were all trying to figure this out very, very quickly, and their mistakes were made. Of course, people were being misled, but we've learned a lot from it. In fact, if you fast forward to the end of 2020 and you ask anybody in the world, what do you do if you have a temperature of 101? Everyone knows, okay, you stay home, right? You quarantine, you wear a mask, you do all this, you make sure contact tracing, you do social distancing. So we know those principles. So let me swing back to the role of the board of directors. I mean, here it took a COVID crisis that affected every individual household. So therefore, and every individual household was forced to learn this well-defined process. Well, it's the job of the board of directors to invoke a governance process so that it's that important to every business unit and every individual working inside of those business units. And so that takes us right to the third one. Senior management should take a more active role, et cetera, et cetera. Breakdown of risks, allocated to each business activity. I've said this to you guys before. I'm a big asset allocator when it comes to decisions in my house, when it comes to decisions at my school, and in other kinds of investment decisions that I make. And so that's exactly what we're doing here, making certain that each business unit has an identifiable liquidity risk so that we can price more appropriately that risk between and among the different business units, right? So notice what we have bolded there, to single out the most important activities. What's the most important thing that I do during the course of the day? Well, you could argue professionally, my job is to educate. And as a parent, my job is to educate. There are other things in there. What else do I do? Well, I take out the garbage, right? So taking out the garbage, that's clearly not the most important activity that I do, even though it serves to promote efficient functioning of the household. That one probably is not going to get a huge amount of effort into liquidity transfer pricing, because I can assure you, my 3 sons have no idea that the garbage goes out on Tuesday nights. And then keeping in line with coming from the board of directors down through the senior executives, compensation and bonuses, of course, should factor in that cost of liquidity. So I love this concept. In some of these chapters that we've talked about of these different business units, remember earlier on we called them silos. Now we're referring to them in these later chapters as business units, and they operate in and of itself, right? So here's this business unit, let's call it wealth management, operating by itself, but it's not an island. And so every decision that's made, especially in terms of liquidity, then has implications throughout the remaining business units. That's why we did all of those correlation analysis. And so those pricings inside of that business unit for liquidity then have to be reflected in any transfer price in which there are multiple activities that occur inside of those business units. Here's another common learning objective. How about some challenges? Poor oversight. Boy, we really just kind of solved this poor oversight challenge if we have coordination and leadership coming from the board flowing all the way down to all of the workers. And so look at for example, if the management does not understand the basics of liquidity pricing, okay, so we're going to erase that. Look, as good financial risk managers, we're going to make sure that we understand the basics of liquidity pricing, and we're going to make sure that everybody we talk to during the course of the day understands the basics of liquidity pricing. Here's an interesting one that I don't remember reading about at all in any of our previous chapters. Of course, Of course, as gigantic bank holding companies, there are opportunities for arbitrage. And so we might think, okay, let's find this arbitrage profit over in one unit, and then let's take those funds and make someone else help us pay for those. Or maybe we sell it to another unit, or maybe we just send it back to the Treasury and sell those funds so that it looks like we're doing all of the profiting, when in fact that probably should be shared, because there are some commonalities. Maybe there's economies of scope going in there somewhere. Infrastructural issues, high quality liquidity reports. Didn't we spend an entire chapter on the importance of liquidity reporting? Remember, we had like the funding maturity gap report, we had liquidity profile, we had funding concentration report, we had a deposit tracker report, we had a whole bunch of these kinds of reports. So now what we can do is take our knowledge of putting those reports together in an efficient manner and using the information from those reports to develop an internal pricing model. That makes perfect sense. And then finally, of course, we're going to use the reporting, we're going to use the leadership, we're going to use the identifying of individual risks to make certain that we link the performance benefits to, any kind of loans or funds over extended periods. All right, how about we get to that learning objective that I think is probably the most important of the four. So let's start with the zero cost approach to liquidity transfer pricing. And as the name suggests, I'll go ahead and read that first block point to you. Ignores accounting for the benefits, costs, and risks of liquidity. Okay, so that doesn't sound very good. So this zero cost approach is an approach that was used way, way, way back in the old days, when liquidity was widely available and it was cheap. So look, no charge was applied to assets for the price of utilizing funding liquidity, and there was no credit application for liabilities for the benefit of providing. And so look at this arrow point. It was the favored approach in the run-up to the global financial crisis. Funding would always be readily available at a steadily inexpensive rate. So we could call this hey, you know what? This is what lots of banks used to do, and let's learn this approach so that we don't repeat the mistakes of this simple approach. And that takes us to the average cost of funds approach, which is, of course, a little bit better, but maybe not substantially better. All right, one rate to credit and charge liability and asset gatherers. Easy to implement and understand. You'll see that here in just a minute in a future slide. But here's what we don't like. It assumes all funds have equal importance. So what does that say? That me taking out the garbage is equally important as educating my children. And of course, that doesn't take into account, it ignores all different sorts of things like embedded optionality. And for my sons, I'm hoping that they have tremendous embedded options somewhere in their brain, so that at some point they figure out life and say, yes, I want to exercise this option and be successful, Dad. So look at the what's that? The fourth one down there makes no attempt to identify the fund's attributes. So this is another reason that we're not going to like this average cost of funds. Might provide unfair advantages, and the transfer rate can be done either internally or externally. Let's take just a quick example, and this is the simplest of all matrices that you've ever seen in your life. Suppose we have an average rate of funding sources, 3 basis points, $100,000. So 3 of 100, so that's a charge of $30 for all loans, and deposits get a credit of $30. So look, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms in years. Excuse me. And then the assets and liabilities there's the 100,000, average cost, 3 basis points. So 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30. So this is really a super simple matrix. What this does, though, the advantage over that zero cost approach, it's almost like the zero cost approach is one of, hey, you know what? Let's just not worry about it. Here, at least we're worrying about it. Now, there are some disadvantages to using this model, and that should be seen clearly in those bottom two rows, right? The charge and the cred at 30, 30, 30. Boy, you should scratch your head and say, you know what, Jim, I don't like 30 at year. I might like 30 in year one, but I surely don't like 30 in year five for both the charge and the credit. Boy, I bet this summarizes what we just did. Fails to factor in the higher liquidity threat. Yep, we just did that. Utilize average cost as a projection of historical prices. Yeah, let's go back here and let me make a comment about that. Average rate across all funding sources is 3 basis points. So if I even go back further, so if I'm using this external, even though it's using the latest market data time series, that's still historical, right? And internally, we might be able to determine this from actual rates, going out on one side of the balance sheet or coming in on another side of the balance sheet. But that probably has lots of an historical context. Now, internally, we might be able to forecast some of these rates, saying, okay, these conditions have changed. So instead of 3 basis points, it might be 3.5 basis points. But nevertheless, where was that? This problem here is a projection of historical prices. And I've said this to you before, that historical prices and historical data, it's a great source as long as history exactly repeats itself. Now, why do banks choose this? Well, you can imagine this. Simple to find the mean, right? Easy to apply for LMIS basics, right? Simple approach makes it easier for banks to understand and comply with the liquidity transfer pricing process. And look at the bottom one there. Minimizes net interest income deviation across all businesses. All right. So I'm not sure we want that. But whatever we want to reflect the reality, we need to make sure that we're not tempted to smooth things out. Accountants are always tempted to do smoothing, but as good financial risk managers, we don't want smoothing. We want actual inflows and outflows. Here's another simple illustration here. There's the swap curve, and so let's just add a little spread to it, a constant spread, so we get that funding curve. Note here that as we go through maturity, it's upward sloping. All right, that makes some sense. But the funding curve has the exact same slope as the swap curve. And that should give you pause. Clearly, you should think of something like, well, you know what? There's different liquidity early on than there is later on. So that funding curve ought to have different kinds of slopes than the swap curve. And we'll see that here in just a few slides. So let's get to probably where the great source of questions will come from regarding this particular learning objective, the matched maturity marginal cost of funds approach. Boy, let me read that first one. The transfer rate assigned to each source is unique and maturity specific. So let me go back to this graph here. So at each maturity, so let's just pick some discrete intervals across that horizontal axis, and then let's pick some rates that are unique to 1 and 2 and 5 and 10 and however we go. All right, so we like that one here. Transfer rate assigned to each use of funds based on expected cash flow stream and the prevailing level of interest rates. All right, so this harkens us back to the pricing of a regular old bond, right? Let's just consider an option-free bond. We have these cash flows, and we can use spot rates to discount those cash flows to come up with a price. So we're going to do the same thing here, but instead of pricing a bond, we're going to price, something inside of one of these business units as it relates to some other business unit. Adopts the behavioral assumptions that reflect common practice. All right, so we like that, behavioral assumptions, and we'll do an example with amortization and without amortization. Look at that arrow point there. Large banks have the capacity to construct a unique marginal cost of funds curve, while smaller banks can probably just use LIBOR. So let me go back to this thing right here. So whether we're using LIBOR or the marginal a marginal cost curve, clearly the slopes are going to be different. And there we go. So look at the red marginal cost of funds curve. It's got the higher slope. First of all, it starts closer to the origin on the vertical axis, of course, right? Higher levels of liquidity are going to have lower yields. And then as we lose liquidity, we're going to have a steeper slope, but then note that it flattens out. So there's that marginal cost of funds curve. And then note that average cost of funds curves. Those of you who have good backgrounds in economics will know that that thing being the average cost is going to take some of those early and some of those later and average them out. And so that slope looks an awful lot like the swap curve. So that's an important distinction between marginal and average and the swap curve. Now let's work through a couple of slides that give us an example. Now this is a relatively simple example, but there's some good information here. We need to pay attention to the question stem. All right, notice that in the table, in that dark red, we have Bank A, which uses the matched maturity approach. And Bank B in the orange uses the average cost approach. So let's look at Bank B down at the bottom. So look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and there's pre-crisis time period and then post-crisis time period. So those basis points are fixed at 3 and then fixed at 8 before and after. All right, so that makes perfect sense based on what we've done before. But now we're going to do this matched maturity approach. So we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pre-crisis, we're going to have, okay, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 basis points, right? We're going to match the liquidity with the basis points, right? But then under that post-crisis or the current period, we're going to assign basis points that reflect the unique liquidity risk for that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 year time period. So note under current, we go 5, then 10, then 15, 24, then 30 basis points. All right, so clearly the top table and the bottom table have different approaches to determining the cost of funds. So let's go ahead and get out our calculator and go ahead and calculate the cost of funds for the loans of both banks. Let's first do Bank A. So let's go and look at that table, which is just a repeat of the table on the previous page. So look at the pre-funding costs. And let's just do a 1-year loan and a 4-year loan. Look at the purple arrow point up there. We assume that each bank makes 2 no amortizing loans, $100,000 each, maturities of 1 and 4 years, pre-crisis and post-crisis. So all we're going to do is take the 1% times the 1 basis point times the 100,000, and then the 4 basis points times the 100,000. So we get $10 and $40, right? Funding costs for a 1-year loan and a 4-year loan. But now, after that crisis, so current, what are we going to do? Well, instead of 1, we're going to use 5, and instead of 4, we're going to use 24. So look at the difference on the bottom right there. Funding cost for the 1-year loan, $50. Funding cost for the 4-year loan, $240. So wow, this matched maturity approach, pre-crisis and post-crisis, is substantially different. I'll come back to that here in just a second. And let's do this just quickly for the average cost approach. So what are we doing? We're taking the 3 basis points times the 100,000, right? And then the 3 basis points times the 100,000. So boy, let's scratch our heads again. All right, 3 basis points for both the 1-year and the 4-year loan. Okay, so that's 30 and 30. And then for the current cost, what did we do? We bumped up the basis points to 8. So 8 times 100,000 gives me 80. So here is a beautiful summary table between these two approaches. So look at this. So for the 1-year loan and the 4-year loan, we got 10 and 40 and 30 and 30. I'm just looking at the top of the table. So what kind of a conclusion can we make? The average cost of funds approach slightly overstates the cost of funding for short-term loans, right? It slightly overstates it, right? 40 versus 30, right? But look down below. Wow, substantially or significantly understating. So the average cost over here has 80, but that 4-year loan is 240. So you get the sense of how cool and informative this matched maturity approach is if we are assigning liquidity risk structures to each loan based on its time period. I would be able to compute the 240 and the 80 for that 4-year loan for the exam. Now, how about if we do an amortizing loan? So, a $500,000 5-year loan repays principal with 5 scheduled principal payments of $100,000 at the end of each year, plus the interest, of course. So there are the basis points, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then 5, 10, 15, 24, and 30. So calculate the charge for this loan. And so we're going to have to use the tranching approach for the amortized loan. So look over on the right. There's just a good formula in the orange box. All we're going to do is take the maturity times those basis points, the spread, of course, in basis points, divided by the sum of the maturities. And so using the pre-crisis costs, we get 3.67, which is about the same, right? That's about the same as we did with that 4-year loan. But under current costs, we get all the way up to 21 basis points. Now, how about that last learning objective about contingent liquidity? So before I take a look at some of the arrow points on the left, let's go look at that illustration. So we've got that liquidity cushion or liquidity buffer, and where does that go? We put some capital in there. Where does it go? Goes to retail, goes to wholesale, goes to drawdown. Hey, maybe some collateral calls on derivatives, and then some secured funding. So this cushion, so I want you to think about that liquidity cushion in there as kind of like a Nerf basketball. We got lots of Nerf basketballs in our house, and so what can you do? Those other circles, they can be like bowling balls, right? Coming in and squishing that liquidity cushion. So we need to replenish that liquidity cushion depending on each one of those business units. So that liquidity cushion, it can be squished because it's a Nerf basketball, but it has to have the ability to replenish. All right, so how do we do that stuff? So that's what we have over here on the left hand side. Contingent commitments are not easy to predict. Of course, when you've got these embedded options, whether they're our option as the institution or the option of our depositor or someone who has our assets, very difficult to predict, especially during stressful times. So think about this. We're going to stress that liquidity cushion much like we did in previous chapters. So stressing that means that we're squeezing that Nerf basketball. And all right, what happens if it's squeezed all the way down, right? How tiny can we get that? And can we survive if that Nerf basketball goes down to like, maybe the size of a golf ball? Contingent cash flows create unexpected funding needs. All right, we know that. Banks are required to hold a liquidity cushion, right, comprised of highly liquid assets. All right, so we talked about that. Should be determined via stress tests and scenario analysis. We like that. Scenario analysis should consider both systematic and unsystematic shocks. The chapter once again calls those idiosyncratic. So think about that liquidity cushion. We're squeezing that Nerf basketball because of factors that are internal and external. How about a quick calculation here? Cost of contingency liquidity risk. There's a good formula in the gray box. Here's the charge. What we're going to do is take some ratio of the limit minus the amount that can be drawn over the limit. So that's, almost like an F over P minus 1 that we did back in time value of money. And then we need to multiply by some probability, and then multiply that by a cost. So let's quickly go through an example. Line of credit, $10 million. $3 million has already been withdrawn. 60% chance that the customer will draw down on the remaining credit. That cost of funding on the liquidity cushion, 20 basis points. So let's go ahead and just throw that formula in there. So there's the 10 minus 3 over the 10 times 0.6 times the 20 basis points. So that gives us 84. And so for the $10 million example, that results in $8,400 worth of a charge for contingent liquidity risk. And I think that takes us through the 4 learning objectives. Once again, I think that third one is most important. But I also think you should go back and have a big old matrix with best practices and challenges for all learning objectives in all of those chapters.